So here we have a superior view of the brain model from the laboratory. I'm going to start with a few basic features. The first, in this view, you can see the gyri and the sulci. So the gyri are the ridges of the brain. They look like ridges or small mountains. You can see the gyri. The singular for gyri is gyrus. The plural would be gyri. The sulci here are those shallow grooves. The sulci is plural. Singular would be sulcus. So these shallow grooves on the cerebral hemispheres are the sulci, and the ridges are the gyri. Plural, gyri, singular, gyrus. Now, a very distinctive feature that can be observed from the superior view of the model is the longitudinal fissure here. The term fissure is used for very deep grooves. So the longitudinal fissure separates the right and left cerebral hemispheres. You can also identify on this model the central sulcus. We use the term sulcus and not fissure because it isn't as deep. So the central sulcus separates the frontal lobe from the two parietal lobes. So here, the frontal lobe, the most anterior part or region of the frontal lobe is involved in higher order cognitive functions such as decision making, thinking, planning. The frontal lobe is also involved in planning and executing voluntary movement and speech production, for example. The two parietal lobes, so we have a right and a left parietal lobe, includes a somatosensory cortex, allows us to be aware of objects around us, integrates sound, and helps us understand speech. So if we come back to the central sulcus here, the gyrus in front of the central sulcus is called the precentral gyrus. Okay? The precentral gyrus is in the frontal lobe, and the precentral gyrus contains the primary motor cortex, and the post-central gyrus, again, here's the central sulcus. So we have the precentral gyrus and the post-central gyrus. The post-central gyrus here has the primary somatosensory cortex. So that central sulcus separates frontal from parietal, but it also separates the primary motor cortex from the primary somatosensory cortex. Now let's take and look at a lateral view of the brain model. Anterior would be frontal lobe. Posterior, now we can see the occipital lobe. We still have that central sulcus, but now we can see the lateral fissure. This is a deeper groove, so it's called a fissure. And the lateral fissure separates the frontal and parietal lobes from the temporal lobe. And the temporal lobe is involved in hearing, smell, even object identification, as well as some of our emotional response and memory. In the lateral view, you can also see the little brain here, the cerebellum. And the cerebellum is going to be involved in coordinating and smoothing our voluntary movements. In the ventral view, we can see the cranial nerves and the brainstem much better. So first, let's review the cranial nerves. Here we have the olfactory bulb and the olfactory nerve. The optic here, so cranial nerve 1, 2. The optic nerves cross here at the optic chiasm. So the optic chiasm is an X-shaped structure formed by the crossing of the optic nerves here. And if I tilt, you can see under the pituitary there, under the pituitary is cranial nerve 3, which is the ocular motor nerve. Cranial nerve 4 is on the pons, that's the trochlear nerve. Cranial nerve 5 is the trigeminal nerve, it's both sensory and motor. Then we have the abducens, cranial nerve 6 is the motor nerve. Cranial nerve 7 is the facial nerve, which is both sensory and motor. Cranial nerve 8 is the vestibular cochlear nerve, and that is going to be a sensory nerve. Then if we tilt again, so we had 6, 7, and 8. Now we're going to go cranial nerve 9, which is the glossopharyngeal nerve, which is both a sensory and motor nerve. Cranial nerve 10, which is both sensory and motor. This nerve, we will learn, is going to be the primary nerve involved in the parasympathetic nervous system. Then we have cranial nerve 11, which is the accessory, which is a motor nerve, and cranial nerve 12, which is the hypoglossal nerve. On this particular model, we actually see the first cervical nerve here at the end. It's not one of the cranial nerves. That's the first cervical nerve. Now let's take a look at the brainstem. We have the midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. The midbrain here is involved in several of our reflexes. The pons acts as a relay station for information between the cerebellum and the cerebral hemispheres. The pons also coordinates with the medulla oblongata in the control of breathing. The medulla oblongata down here, it's the most inferior part of the brainstem. The medulla oblongata controls many of our involuntary functions, such as breathing, swallowing, maintaining blood pressure, and even vomiting will be mediated by the medulla oblongata. And then of course you can see the cerebellum very clearly here, and the cerebellum is involved in coordinating and smoothing our voluntary movements. Now, here we have the pituitary. The pituitary is attached to the brain by the infundibulum. The infundibulum is a very thin structure, and as a result, most of our models and our intact brains lack a pituitary. It ends up falling off. Under the pituitary here, sort of hidden, are true structures called the mammillary bodies. So the two mammillary bodies are sort of hidden under here. All right, let's open the model. This is a mid-sagittal section. Anterior region would have the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, and then the occipital lobe here. The two cerebral hemispheres are separated by the corpus callosum. So this larger structure is the corpus callosum. The two lateral ventricles are separated by the septum pellucidum, so this very thin membrane here. This is the fornix. This is the choroid plexus in pink, so this is on the roof of the third ventricle. If you recall, the choroid plexus produces cerebrospinal fluid and contains ependymal cells, one of the glial cells that we learn. This region here is the thalamus. The thalamus is the integrating center and relay station for sensory and motor information. So sensory information coming up from the spinal cord and then being distributed to the cortex, and then information coming down or descending the spinal cord. The hypothalamus here is involved in maintaining homeostasis and our behavioral drives such as hunger and thirst response. Here you can see the infundibulum to the pituitary, and the pituitary gland is one of our endocrine system glands. We'll learn that there's an anterior and posterior region to the pituitary gland. Here you see the left mammillary body. Then we can move on to the brain stem. This region up here is the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. So those three regions make up the brain stem. This void, this sort of empty cavity, represents the third ventricle, and of course the choroid plexus is on the roof of the third ventricle. The third ventricle is connected to the fourth ventricle by this thin tube called the cerebral aqueduct. So the third ventricle would be the void here. It's connected to the fourth ventricle, which sits between the pons and the cerebellum. The fourth ventricle would be here. Here you can see the cerebellum again, and in the mid-sagittal view you can see what's referred to as the tree of life. Anatomically we call that the arbor vitae. Okay, so the arbor vitae, or tree of life, is part of the cerebellum, and the cerebellum is responsible for coordinating and smoothing our voluntary movement. Now if we go back up here to the midbrain and tilt sideways, we can see one half of the corpora quadrigemina. So here is a superior colliculus. The superior colliculi together are involved in visual reflexes. For example, when your eyes track and follow a moving object through your field of view. Below the superior colliculi are the inferior colliculi. A singular mound is the inferior colliculus. These two together are involved in our reflexive responses to sudden and disruptive sound, so something that might startle you. So here's the corpus callosum, the choroid plexus, and right here above the corpora quadrigemina is the pineal gland. And the pineal gland is part of the epithalamus. So here's the thalamus, and inferior to that would be the epithalamus. And the pineal gland is involved in releasing melatonin. So the pineal gland is going to be one of the glands we learn in the endocrine system. And melatonin helps regulate our cycle, our sleep cycle.